Today I was thinking about how might meditation be helpful for you now as you are approaching midterms and mid-semester peak stress, perhaps. And I thought the answer is, at least for many people, it is to give yourself a break, give yourself like understanding, acceptance, forgiveness if that's necessary, um, permission to let go of stress for a time in order to pick it up again with a calmer, clearer mind. And I do recommend meditating, whether it's once a day or once a week, for anywhere from as long as 5 minutes to 30 minutes, as long as you can take. It's good for you and good for me. All right. Now I'm ready to start lecture. So, oh, before I do are there any comments or questions that you'd like to ask first? Okay. Um, all right. So let me share my screen. There it is. Okay, today's lecture. This is lecture 7, Cognitive and Behavioral Psychology and Therapies. The topics of,
Professor,
yes.
we haven't got the lecture slides on Blackboard yet. So do you mind to put it on Blackboard?
It is on Blackboard, not session.
I uploaded it like at 1 o'clock, so
Oh,
very last
okay,
minute.
sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Learning, thinking, and therapeutic applications. In that order. First, learning. Unlike instincts and reflexes, learned behaviors involve change and experience. We learn, and that learning is relatively permanent in our changed behavior and knowledge and the results from our experience. I say relatively. Really, if you want something to be relatively permanent, you need to rehearse it multiple times and continue to rehearse throughout your life. What you use, you retain, you keep. What you don't use, you lose over time. So any kind of learned behaviors or learned thought patterns must be rehearsed. Second point, our minds have a natural tendency to connect events that occur closely together or in sequence. Associative learning occurs when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. It's central to all three basic learning processes. Associative learning is. So we need associative learning in classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, also called vicarious learning. Classical conditioning involves unconsciously controlled processes or responses that are automatic. So they are controlled by the brain, but not under our conscious control. At least that's what it seems like. Um, Whereas operant conditioning involves consciously controlled responses. So, for example, if you're learning to not wet your bed, which most of you have learned by now, uh, this seems like it's a something that is not under your conscious control, whether you hold your bladder in the nighttime or not. So it seems like we would require classical conditioning for that. However, bladder control is consciously controlled. It seems unconsciously controlled when you're sleeping. So it's kind of ambiguous, right? So we might use classical or operant conditioning when we're trying to learn bladder control. And then observational learning is where you use, where you watch other people and learn from them. So you can use social learning, associating the punishments and rewards that someone else gets from their behavior so that you know whether or not you want to replicate their behaviors or not. Any questions? This slide illustrates classical conditioning. A dog naturally drools in the presence of food, but not at the presence of a bell. But if you put them together during training, then you can get the dog to associate the two stimuli together so that even the bell alone can trigger the behavior unconsciously outside of conscious control. It becomes a classically conditioned reflex. Classically conditioned means that a reflexive behavior is learned. The association is learned. Any questions? All right, so yeah, just the dingle of the bell after training will cause the dog to salivate, even if the dog knows that you're not bringing food, because it's not a consciously controlled process, it's unconscious. So even if the dog knows that there's no food coming, the bell will cause the drooling to occur by unconscious mental processes through unconscious association or unconscious training, which we call classical conditioning. Do you suppose that humans can be classically conditioned?
Yes, they've already done it. The
Absolutely, correct.
one
Especially
I can
babies.
remember is the little Albert experiment where
Yeah.
he was conditioned to fear like
White
furry
fluffy
things,
things, I think.
white fluffy things.
Yeah.
Every
Correct.
time they showed and touched one, someone would like bang a gong. Got so bad that the kid was scared of people with white beards.
Very good.
And,
That's right.
and
That
another tidbit: the guy who made that experiment, he went into advertising.
Oh, nice twist. I'm sure he was effective for his advertising team, taking with him the knowledge of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Yeah, very good. That's right. It's kind of both, right? I mean, well, his fear response was classically conditioned. Right, yeah. Certainly, absolutely. Good example. Operant conditioning. Organisms learn to associate a behavior and its consequences. A pleasant consequence makes that behavior more likely to be repeated, and punishments make it less likely that that behavior would be repeated. So we can have positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. And those 2x2 combinations create 4 possible scenarios. You can have positive or negative reinforcement, positive or negative punishment. Yeah. Skinner used shaping to teach pigeons how to play ping pong. And I'm going to show that video in a moment. Well, I'll show it right now. Now you saw that the pigeons only went into their little feeding box every time they scored a point. They have learned to associate the result of their ping pong playing abilities with opportunity to get a reward. So how to shape behavior. So how did Skinner and other people train animals to do things that look like they are incredibly smart animals, like they can play ping pong? This is how you shape behavior. The organism must spontaneously display an approximation of one step of the behavior, and then you give that reward for that behavior. And then you become more selective. You reinforce any response that resembles the desired behavior, but you become more selective in your rewarding. So it has to be more and more exactly like what you're looking for. You don't want to wait for the perfect behavior to begin with, because you'll be waiting forever for that ideal behavior. Instead, you reward gradually improving behaviors. So step 3 is selectively reinforce responses that more closely resemble the desired behavior until you only reinforce the desired behavior. Whose behavior can you shape? Type that in the chat box. I'm interested to see who or what behavior you could shape, and maybe some ideas of how you could shape, or yeah. So I'll be interested to see what you guys come up with here. Dogs, pets, kids. Someone was clever and wrote myself. That's a very good answer. Certainly, you can use operant conditioning on yourself. You can use it on other people and babies. Okay, good answers. Reinforcement and latent learning. Reinforcement is the continued application of rewards and punishments to encourage continuous learning. Latent learning is when no reinforcements are used, yet learning is taking place anyway. That's because even when no reinforcements are being offered, we are very good at noticing reinforcements besides the ones that are externally offered. So we learn very subtle forms of reinforcement from our own behaviors and from other watching other people. So we often engage in latent learning, and there's an example in uh, oh yeah, like um, you can train rats to run a maze by to run faster through a maze by offering a reward at the end of the maze. So you let them run the maze multiple times, and every time you offer a reward, they will get very speedy and they will build a memory of the maze. But what if you don't offer a reward and you just let the rat explore the maze on their own? Then they are engaged in latent learning where there is no reinforcement offered. When you finally do offer a reward, the rat demonstrates latent learning by running the maze very quickly, even though there was no previous reinforcement for running it, which reveals that they were learning the maze even in the absence of external reinforcements. So that's what latent learning is. It's learning that happens spontaneously without outside intervention or outside external rewards or reinforcements. Externally applied means applied from the outside by the experimenter. Yeah. Observational learning. Monkey see, monkey do. What you see other people do, you learn from them. That's called vicarious learning. We are often engaged in vicarious or observational learning. We learn from other people. We don't always have to learn by directly receiving the punishments and rewards ourselves. We can learn from live models, verbal descriptions, and models from media. For example, YouTube, podcasts, books, etc., TV. Vicarious learning is affected by vicarious rewards and punishments, as well as attention, retention, reproduction, motivation. We have prosocial and antisocial models. We don't have to respect the model to learn from them. We can learn by mere observation, but we are more effective at learning from models that we like, that we have some emotional connection to. But it's still possible to learn from people that we don't like. By the time we graduate high school, we have been exposed to about 200,000 acts of violence through media. Now, that estimate is for an American college student or high school student, someone that's reached about 18 years of age. I don't know what that would be in Thailand, but I reckon that it would be half that much. Because American cinema and media seems to be particularly violent compared to other um, media cultures in the world.
How about like in America? How um, in high school everyone's kind of worried of the whole, you know, uh, school shooting thing. They have that sort of. It's become kind of like a joke in American schools that this sort of thing is going to happen. Even though it's a joke, some teenagers will take it seriously and have it loom over them, So I think it's just like another thing, but with more dangerous repercussions if it ever comes true.
Yes, you're talking about the idea that seeing violence in the media affects behavior,
Well,
creates.
I'm saying like in America in high schools and stuff, there's been so many instances of school shooting. It's become like some sort of almost a guarantee that would happen to like the students in the schools. I've seen actual schools like made for violence, like as in there's shutters, there's walls to hide from bullets. I've seen a whole school made in that way, and it's become
Wow.
kind of like like a sort of
Wow.
social fear.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
becoming more prevalent now.
Yeah. It's bad. Thoughts are okay. So now we move from learning to thinking. Thinking or thoughts are influenced by sensations, emotions, memories, behaviors, and then thoughts affect later thoughts. So we have all of these um, influences on our thinking. Memory is stored information grouped and tagged by relatedness to other information, just like books in a library. Concepts are groupings in memory. Concepts can be abstract or concrete, communal, group, personal, artificial, natural, weakly developed, strongly developed. And I provide examples for all of these. All right, so this slide is kind of like thrown together all kinds of things from cognitive psychology, thoughts, memories, concepts. And I have a little picture of I think it might be well, I don't know what it is, but it's a seed and growth is happening from the seed. That illustrates how um, a category, it's illustrating that last little bullet point on uh, categories. When categories become stronger, they no longer rely on their prototype. Just like a tree no longer relies upon its seed for nutrition and growth, it takes on sufficiency by itself. So I just wanted to introduce thinking at a broad level first, because later I will relate these things to um, cognitive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, so next slide. Complex thoughts. Concepts, so leading from the previous slide on concepts, concepts can be connected or related to other concepts to form more complex thoughts or concepts. For example, we can talk about the free market. That's very broad and a very high level concept. So the free market serves fish markets. Now that's getting more specific. To serve fish, restaurants, which is even more specific. To serve fish, which is even more specific. So each of these concepts are related to the previous one, and you can think of them as all somewhat hierarchically related to the first one, the free market. So there's hierarchical organization between concepts that are related to other concepts. Maybe it's not useful to think of them as hierarchically related, just related. All right, so concepts relate to other concepts, and then these interrelated concepts form schema. Schema greatly facilitate recognition. So once you have an activation of a schema in mind where you think of the concept or the schema, it relates to all of its related concepts. Then you have greater and more quick and easy activation of anything within that schema, within that web of interconnecting ideas. All of those concepts are more readily activated once you have activated one schema or one concept within a schema. So it activates the schema. So yeah, interrelated concepts form schema. Schema are like the networks of related concepts. All right, so schema can greatly facilitate recognition and processing and storage and retrieval of new information. Basically, new information, when you're trying to get it into your head, it flows into your head more easily and into your memory and into your processing more easily if it flows into an activated region of your brain. And you activate brain regions by previous activation, by activating it or priming it. It's like it's easier to light a candle if you light it with an already lit candle. All right, so we've got event schema and role schema. Event schema are like community rules, what to do in a public restroom. You know what to do because you have many associated events in your memory. You have memory of using many different public restrooms, so you can rely on the event of using the restroom, public restroom, a common event. And then we have role schema, for example, social roles, how to behave when you're with your parents. You know that not only because of the many events of interacting with your parents, but you've learned your role and you rely on that social role to know how to respond whenever you want to respond to your parents. All right, here's a picture example. You've probably been wondering what this is for a number of minutes now. What context helps to recognize this picture? Do you know what this is?
From Finding Nemo.
From Finding Nemo, it's that turtle
Nemo.
that
Yeah.
was riding the waves.
Yeah, he always looked high.
Correct.
Like he was on a lot of drugs.
Yeah, correct. That's from the Nemo movie. Not everyone would recognize that unless they'd seen the movie. But, you know, now you've got that context. Well, you don't have much context on this slide. You only have the blue background, which suggests water, and maybe some freckles on the turtle's face. Is it a turtle? I think it is.
It's the turtle. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Yeah, so something that would, like, if you didn't recognize that picture, something that would help you to recognize it would be, think of a movie. Now you've activated movie schema. that helps you to kind of sift through possible interpretations. It's like helps to narrow the the field of possibilities, and it activates certain schema. And then I could say, think of underwater, and that would further activate schema and help constrain the possibilities and help you to recognize the image. Uh-huh. Problem solving. Okay, so we can solve problems using heuristics. First heuristic is the trial and error, trying different solutions until a problem is found. This is a very simple heuristic. For example, if your phone is malfunctioning, you might just try a number of things that you've found to work before, like restarting your phone, turning off Wi-Fi, turning off Bluetooth, whatever you think might work, or whatever has worked before, even if you don't understand why it might work. Without understanding, you might just try things until you accidentally find something that works. An algorithm formula is another type of heuristic. A heuristic is any problem-solving strategy. This could include working backwards, breaking a task into steps, etc. Algorithm formula is a step-by-step, highly detailed instruction list that produces the same result every time. The instruction manual for installing new software on your computer is an example of an algorithm formula for problem solving, how to install something on your computer. Google search results and Facebook feed rely on algorithm formulas. So whether your problem-solving strategy is trial and error, or algorithm, or working backwards, or breaking it into steps, all of these are kinds of heuristics. A heuristic is any strategy. Sometimes it's called mental shortcut. It's only a shortcut in the sense that you don't have to come up with the best heuristic. If you just come up with any one heuristic, then you use it. All right, so now you don't have to think of a heuristic anymore. But a heuristic is any strategy, any method.
I'm sorry, it's like any method that's like above the trial and error.
Yeah, including trial and error. Because trial and error is
So-
one method.
Oh, of heuristic.
Trial and error is
Okay.
just one possible strategy. But heuristic is any strategy. When do we use heuristics? We use them when we're faced with too much information, when the time to make a decision is limited, and when the decision to be made is semi-important, so you don't have to have a perfect decision, and when information is limited to make the decision. I'm using the definition of heuristic that is kind of like the cognitive shortcut. I could say this in a different way. I should. So, like, when do we jump to a heuristic? Really, we're kind of forced to use a heuristic. Yeah. When we think about using heuristics, we usually think of jumping to a strategy without giving it a lot of thought. And so we do jump to heuristics when we're faced with too much information, when the time for making decision is limited, when the decision is semi-important, and when information is limited. I think I could revise this slide a little just to include the word, when do we jump to heuristics? I'll do that. I'll revise the slide and re-upload to Blackboard so you can study a better slide when you study this later on. Let me make a note to myself. All right. Examples of heuristics working backwards, like when you decide whether you have time for a shower before class, you have to measure when does class start, working backwards, how many minutes does it take? Breaking a task into different steps or stages, like your book report assignment requires you to read a book first, and then make some notes second, and then write up a report from that third, probably. And then availability, that's the use of any heuristic activated recently or easily. That itself is a heuristic. So it's using a heuristic to choose a heuristic to solve a problem. So it gets a little complicated there. The availability heuristic is the use of any heuristic that was activated recently or is easy to activate because it's available on your mind. It just occurs to you. And because it occurred to you first, it's available. And if you just use what's available, that itself is a kind of heuristic. So we could say up at the top, when do we use the availability heuristic? That would be a way to fix that slide. The title, yeah. All right, I think it's a good time to take a break because, yeah, we're changing topics right after this slide. So let's have a 10-minute break. Come back to class at 5 till 2.
Okay.
I have already revised the slide and uploaded it to Blackboard. So if you download henceforth, it'll look like this, the slide we were talking about that I was covering before. So I just added the word simpler, like when do we use simpler heuristics? Those that are not fine-tuned to the solution. That's when we don't have enough information, decision time is limited, and it's not too important. Problem solving. A mental set is where you persistently use a problem-solving approach that has worked in the past, but is clearly not working anymore. Albert Einstein famously said, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result." And yet that is what we do a lot of times because of our mental sets. Functional fixedness is a mental set instantiated with objects whose functions you know too well, causing you to be unable to see alternate possible functions because of seeing the primary function too absolutely. Now, not functional fixedness is this picture of someone using a fan to blow off the leaves and dirt from a walkway or driveway in front of their house. It's not functional fixedness because it's breaking out of the original function. So the original function of the fan is to be set in a stationary location and to cool people off, not to blow away debris. So to think about it as possibly solving your problem of how to get all the debris off of the driveway, that requires breaking out of functional fixedness to solve the problem, or to use tools to solve your problems. All right, here on the bottom right of the screen, we have a pack of matches, a box of tacks or thumbtacks, and a candle. It's a problem for you to do in your mind. If you can mentally imagine, try to find a solution. How can you attach a candle to a wall using only these items? Take 30 seconds or a minute to think about that, and then I'll ask you if you have any solution. Okay, I'll call on students now. Anyone who thinks they have a solution, go ahead and speak up.
Um, I think like you can use the thumbtack to like push the wick of the candle into the wall, and then light up a match and heat up one side of the candlestick so that's melted, and then stick it to the wall.
Very good. I like that. Any other solutions?
If you melt one side of the candle, like the whole length of it, and then let it cool on the wall, then that might also fix it onto the wall.
I like your solution. So both of these involved not even using the thumbtacks. Or, yeah, very good. I like that.
How strong is the wall? Like, is it like drywall?
Imagine
if
it.
you could use, what about if we use the actual box? Does the box count within the tic tacs? You mean the thumbtacks? Does the box count?
Very good. That's the solution that goes beyond the functional fixedness of box as a container for tacks. It could also be used as a tool to solve the problem.
Yeah, I was thinking of something like attaching the tacks to the wall and with the box as well, and you just put the candle in the middle of the box.
Very good. That's right. That's the solution. That if I showed this picture further below the slide, I have cut off a visual solution that basically illustrates exactly what you said. So an example of breaking out of the mental set, or not being limited by functional fixedness. Because normally the box with tax in it is seen as simply a container for tax. It's not thought of as a possible tool. So it illustrates this concept. All right. That is the issue with mental set and functional fixedness. Now I go on. Decision biases. Biases tend to preserve that which already is established. Our pre-existing knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes and hypotheses. So we've talked about biases before when we were talking about prejudice, social psychology, and now we're looking at bias more generally, not just social bias, but bias in general, cognitive bias. So we have biases that tend to preserve and cater to our existing knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, and hypotheses. There's the anchoring bias, confirmation bias, and hindsight bias. These are just 3 types. There are more than these, but these are 3 I wanted to teach. Anchoring bias is where we have the tendency to focus on one particular piece of information when making decisions or problem solving. Anchoring is particularly used when you're trying to sell something or buy something, and there's some negotiation possible. So the anchor is the first price set, and then maybe a sub-anchor is the first negotiation suggested, and then there's a work between for those 2 prices. But the first price set is the biggest anchor. All right, then there's the confirmation bias, which focuses on information that contains existing beliefs. Confirms existing beliefs. This is a very problematic one because it's very general. And then there's hindsight bias, where our beliefs that an event that was just experienced seems predictable in hindsight. I should have known. We all should have known. No, not necessarily. Everything looks clearer and seems easier to understand in hindsight. Any questions? Or would you like an example of any of these?
Professor, can I have an example of confirmation bias?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let's say that you believe that participants in a group will respond more favorably to your product. Let's say you are selling breath mint, and you think that if you sell to a group, you're going to get more favorable response than if you try to sell to individual people. So you have your hypothesis, and you want to confirm it, because we all have confirmation bias. We seek to confirm that which we already believe. So in a group setting, you will ask, how much do you like these breath mints? And then in one-on-one setting, you might ask, how likely are you to buy these? So by changing the question, you get different answers. Or another example is if you're speaking to the group, you might speak with more smile and more positive expectation that just, even if you use the same words, but your expression is more positive because you seek to confirm. Whereas on one-on-one setting, you don't expect to confirm your hypothesis, so you ask with a more straight face. So these little subtle things that you do affect what you get. But confirmation bias here, it says, focuses on information that confirms existing beliefs. So it's like paying more attention to the yeses. Yes, I like this. I like the breath mints. Whereas, so yeah, maybe my example was not a good one. Because this one, confirmation bias, is where you're focusing on information that confirms existing beliefs. So you might focus more on their nods of approval, their smiles, and ignore their actual verbal answer. Maybe nobody answered, but they nodded their heads. And so you just pay attention to the head nod. That's confirmation bias. Ignoring irrelevant or ignoring information that undermines your hypothesis. Would you like an example for either of the other types of bias?
Yes, please.
Okay, anchoring, I already gave an example with haggling over prices. Hindsight bias is like you might say to yourself, you don't know why you chose such a long and complex book for your book report. You should have known to choose a shorter one because you should have known that you would be stressed with midterms and other classwork, and that it would be unmanageable to read a really big, thick, small font book with many pages. But that's ignoring the fact that you didn't know how demanding the semester was going to become. So to ignore or to forget that you did not know in advance, to forget that you could not predict the future, that's hindsight bias. Creative thinking. Creativity is the ability to create, or discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. We need creativity to find ourselves, to find our way out of difficult situations, or to find our way into difficult goals. Like a rat wants to find the cheese at the end of the maze. Creative thinking might be to climb the wall or to just run really quickly. When we talk about creativity, it's almost implied already that there are multiple possible solutions. So if there's only one way to get to the goal in a maze, that's not really creative thinking. Creative is like finding an additional pathway or strategy. Very creative, highly prized work, the kind of work that you hope to do someday, comes from people with great knowledge about something, many years of work experience, novel solutions, getting advice and help from others, and taking risks. You could think of these as coming into play for Olympic athletes. They work, they have, it doesn't seem like a creative endeavor, but they have their highly prized work comes from years of experience and getting advice from other experts and taking risks. Often defined as a function of one's ability to engage in divergent thinking or thinking outside the box, arriving at unique or multiple solutions to a given problem, in contrast to convergent thinking. Convergent thinking, on the other hand, is thinking described by the ability to provide a correct or well-established answer or solution to a problem. So these two are contrasted to each other, divergent and convergent thinking. The most encouraged type of thinking in different subjects, like in math, we use convergent thinking. We seem to emphasize convergent thinking. In school in general, we tend to encourage convergent thinking. And in basic living in society, we tend to encourage convergent thinking. But we do encourage divergent thinking in all of these domains as well. Whenever you get complimented for coming up with a novel, creative solution, that shows that divergent thinking is also valued and promoted and encouraged. So it's usually, divergent thinking is usually encouraged based on your results, whether you can be successful or not. But if you're not successful, then divergent thinking is often punished or discouraged. Convergent thinking is sort of safer, using the strategy that everyone else thinks to use from the get-go. Any questions or thoughts? All right, I'm giving you this crash course in thinking. Thinking is its own subject in its own right. But in this lecture, I'm combining learning, thinking, and therapy. So now we go on to the final leg, the third leg of the lecture, therapy. Is there a high demand for therapy these days? Well, in 2014, in the US, according to the survey put out by the US Department of Mental Health, we learned that 1 in 5 Americans over the age of 13 experienced a mental health issue within that year. So it's not in their whole life, it's within the year of 2014 when they did the survey. 1 in 10 young people experienced a period of major depression during that year. 1 in 25 lived with a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or major depression within that year, at least part of the year. And kind of like a side note, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in the United States in that year. So, as you can see from these proportions, mental health is an issue. It's a common problem among Americans and presumably among all peoples in every country. Because psychological problems can originate from various sources, such as biology, genetics, childhood experiences, conditioning, sociocultural influences, so psychologists have developed many different therapeutic techniques and approaches that take into account all these different causes. Now I'm offering you a history of institutions. So we get a little history of psychology here. Exorcism was performed by religious figures, so this is pre-psychology. Incantations, which are like prayers and almost like magical poetry. Some medicinal drinks, something called trepanning, which is frightening to think about. It's where you drill a small hole into the skull of a person who's dealing with something wrong with them. They're crazy in some kind of way. And of course, I use the word crazy instead of mental health because I am reverting back to the old thinking, where the assumption was there's evil spirits, and if you drill a hole into their head, the spirits can come out. So many people died from this. Other approaches, one solution to the problem of a person being mentally ill is to simply execute them. Other solutions were to imprison them, to leave them, to not do anything, just leave them as homeless beggars. Many of them were accused of witchcraft, and they were burned at the stake. So, old institution of dealing with the mentally unwell was not very successful or ethical. 18th century asylums were windowless dungeons where inmates were beaten or chained to their beds and had little or to no contact with caregivers. The goal was not to treat them, really, not to make them better, but simply to ostracize them, which means to separate them from society, to exclude them, to make them disappear, but without killing them. Dorothy Dix was well known because she worked reforms in asylums in the US. So at the time when she went to work trying to reform asylums, they were filthy, they offered very little treatment, and they kept people for decades. For example, one asylum in New York submerged patients in cold water baths for long periods of time, thinking that that was a kind of solution, kind of therapeutic, but really it just put them into hypothermic state where their hypothermia was the bigger problem than their mental illness. And another solution was electroshock, but this was done with too much electricity and without any anesthesia, and it often caused physical damage, such as a broken bone. So Dorothy Dix helped to introduce more healing and therapeutic activities such as open air, sunshine, maybe walking around outside. I don't really know all of what she offered, but she offered some experimental treatments that were much more humane and caring toward the prisoners, toward the inmates, and the results were spectacular. Patients that were assumed to be permanently incapacitated were showing remission of their illnesses and they were able to be released. So she was a very helpful, important figure during the dark ages of institutionalization. Next came this movement in the 60s where there was a deinstitutionalization movement and mishap in the United States. In the 60s, drug therapies were greatly came into vogue and were found to be very effective at curing a lot of ailments like bipolar, schizophrenia. There were some treatments, some medical, chemical treatments that were developed. So because of these drugs, there was this movement to deinstitutionalize patients from the physical asylums, the physical institution of treating people in asylums. So drugs helped people to get back in touch with reality. So that's particularly for psychotic illnesses, those that relate to losing touch with reality. But also bipolar treatment came in around, well, maybe decades earlier, I'm not sure. So deinstitutionalization was a national policy. So asylums started closing down. Patients started moving out of hospitals to be treated at local clinics in their own communities. However, this was a mishap because the local communities were not able to effectively deal with the types of patients that were being released from the asylums. So the system was not set up effectively. Centers were underfunded, staff was not trained to handle serious illness. There were high staff burnout, no provision made for other services that were needed, such as housing, food, and job training. So it was really a blunder. Without these supports, people that were released from asylums under this new deinstitutionalization policy often ended up as homeless people. Today, 1 in 4 homeless shelters in the United States are living with mental illness. And similar numbers are living with mental illness in prisons and jails. These are not treatment centers. The mentally ill are still being ignored and ostracized today because we have too heavily emphasized deinstitutionalization, would be my take on that. We have not come up with adequate means of treating patients at the local community level. Asylums were not good, but we haven't come up with anything like vastly better because of the issue of accessibility. So Although we have many services and treatments available today for all kinds of mental illnesses, but people with mental illnesses still don't have excellent access to those services. We're working on that day by day, decade by decade. We are improving on that. But it is a slow process. It has been a slow process. Any thoughts or questions? This is true in Thailand, and this is true in America. Every country. It's kind of like the same thing with physical illnesses. When you get physically ill, you go to a doctor. But the doctor may not help you. They might have to send you to a specialist. But the specialist might be booked for a month or might only operate in another province or might be too expensive for you. So again, just like with difficult to access treatment, whether it's physical or mental, we have to, as a society, we need to find a way to solve this lack of access between those who need the treatment and those who offer it, who can offer it. And now, institutions today, now hospitals, we don't call them asylums anymore, offer short-term treatments. These can be a few days to a few weeks, or it could be walk in and walk out a few hours later, possibly. Usually individuals are hospitalized only if they are an imminent threat to themselves or to others, because hospital stays are very expensive. Many hospitals in Bangkok have a psychiatric ward or section. So you can seek mental treatment in a hospital in Thailand, but not every hospital, only certain ones. And one of them, Manarom Hospital at least, is dedicated to mental health only. So this is a psychiatric hospital in Bang Na. I took my Gen Ed Intro to Psych class there on a field trip once. And one of our psychology faculty sees patients there. This is a mental health kind of like clinic, but it's the size of a hospital. It is a hospital. So it's a full-sized, it's a major clinic. That's what a hospital is, after all. And I don't know of others, but I'm sure there's others in Thailand. And like I said, sections within hospitals, as well as standalone clinics. I know of at least one or two clinics that are small and include walk-in consultations and psychology and psychiatry. In fact, our own faculty of psychology has schedule by phone and maybe even walk-in treatments, mental health only, no prescriptions, talking therapy. All right, so that's kind of where we're ending up today, where we offer therapy and therapeutic solutions to people who need them in hospitals, in clinics. Yeah.
Will there be any field trips for us?
No, I don't have any such things scheduled.
Aw.
You're disappointed, I think, a little. Yeah. Yeah. I only did that once. It was enjoyable. a little, yeah, a little pricey, a little unnecessary, I think. But I don't know. Maybe I should do that in future years. Um, do you want another break now? I can tell you we are, let's see. What do you think?
I'm fine with one or without one.
Okay. Because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, we have a lot of slides, so let's have another break. Okay, so it's 2:32. We'll have a 10-minute break, so come back at 2:42. In other words, just to well, it's like you can't deal with some part of your mind that you have no access to. And you can't deal with it when you're going through the panic or phobia because you forget. You forget how to deal with it when you're in that moment. So virtual reality, or really what I'm talking about is in general, counter conditioning through aversive conditioning and exposure therapy. Exposure therapy and systematic desensitization. These allow you to bring in tools of calm and collected dealing with, and yet being there in the traumatic or fear-inducing environment. So it's bringing more calm and collected tools to bear on the problem. Any thoughts or questions? All right. Behavior therapy and operant conditioning. So reinforced behaviors tend to be repeated. Punished behaviors, or behaviors not reinforced, tend to become extinguished over time. These two principles can effectively help children with autism in a technique called applied behavior analysis, or ABA therapy. As a matter of fact, my nephew is receiving ABA therapy for autism. Child-specific reinforcers, such as stickers, praise, candy, bubbles, extra playtime, all of these rewards can be given to children when they demonstrate desirable behaviors, such as sitting in a chair when requested, verbalizing a greeting, making eye contact. Punishments, such as timeout or a sharp no, discourage undesirable behaviors such as pinching, scratching, pulling hair. In other words, it's basic rewards and punishments, just like we would normally do with children. We just do it very systematically and very consciously, very intentionally, and we call that therapy now. A popular version is the token economy, and this has been generalized to be able to be used with all ages, adults and children. Individuals are reinforced with tokens, such as poker chips, that can be exchanged for items or privileges. It's often used in psychiatric hospitals, Patients are rewarded with tokens when they engage in positive behaviors, such as making their bed, brushing their teeth, coming to the cafeteria on time, socializing with other patients. They can exchange the tokens for extra TV time, private room, visits to the canteen, etc. So I'm not sure if these can be used in prisons or if they have been, but I see no reason why not. I have experienced this in my elementary life when I was in elementary. I think grade 3, 4, 5. I think grade 2, grade 1, kindergarten. Yeah. A lot of my teachers used some kind of variation of a token economy, basically applied behavior analysis. How about you? Did you experience any token economy when you were in lower grades?
Yeah, in like year 1, year 2.
Yeah. What was it like? What kind of rewards did you get or tokens?
Like if we collected, I think 30 stickers, the professor would buy us pizza.
Was it effective?
Yeah.
Great.
In my school, we had like a point system where the good that we did and how well we did in our class, we're given like points and such. But I don't actually remember having any rewards from it. We did it so many times that I kind of forgot what we got in return for the points.
Very good.
It was the opposite for me. Teachers would put like names of bad students on the board.
I got that. That's right. If you get your name with 3 strikes, you missed recess or something,
Oh,
right?
we got spanked back then.
Oh, spanked. The
Oh no.
teacher with the hand, right?
Corporal abuse?
Sometimes with a ruler.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
that's corporal punishment. Sorry.
I also got slapped with a ruler in 1st grade.
Is that legal?
It was legal at that time, and it seems to be no longer legal now. Yes.
Well, I come from a not so good place in Thailand, so.
But it was effective. It was very effective. So.
And scarred kids for life.
Yeah. And it had the unfortunate side effect of scarring kids for life. Cognitive therapy was developed by Aaron back in the 60s. Cognitive therapy focuses on changing a person's dysfunctional thoughts, which are causing distress. The client is shown how they misinterpret a situation through cognitive distortions. And these distortions are corrected and replaced with more positive thinking, which is supposed to be made into a habit to bypass negative thinking loops that downward spiral into depression. So, for example, if someone fails a test, they can have the internal belief, I'm worthless and stupid, or they could have the internal belief, I'm smart, but I didn't study for this test and I can do better. So depending on the particular tendency toward one type of belief or another, one type of thought process, thought habit, or thought pattern, or another, that could produce depression or not depression. I have a little video to show. It's all about correcting the thoughts and leading the patient out of depression or anxiety by by addressing their thoughts, because the assumption, and it's pretty well demonstrated to be true, is that depressed thinking leads to, um, negative thinking leads to depression. So if we could just change that negative thinking. But we also have behavioral therapy, which we talked about before that. So how about if we could combine the two together into cognitive behavioral therapy? That's what Albert Ellis thought. And in reaction to Freudian therapy, he founded the cognitive behavioral therapy, which is simply combining both cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy. So the cognitive therapy part of this combined therapy program is to get clients to examine how their thoughts affect their behavior, change their cognitive distortions and self-defeating behaviors, attempts to make the individual aware of their irrational and negative thoughts to replace them with more positive thoughts.
Sir, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. All right, so that's the cognitive part. Now there's the behavioral part, how to eliminate self-defeating behaviors and increase positive, healthy behaviors. And we've already talked about behavioral therapy. So what is the effectiveness of this combined strategy program? Hundreds of studies have shown that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is effective in treatment of numerous psychological disorders. For example, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, eating disorders, bipolar, substance abuse. There's a great number and great variety of illnesses or conditions that are helped by CBT. So it might sound like that must be the best, most effective therapy out there. I would say yes, that's probably true in general, on the whole. However, different problems call for different approaches. And while CBT is very broadly useful, it is not the most useful thing for certain kinds of problems, certain types. And I'm going on to talk more about effectiveness. The effectiveness of therapy in general. The APA, or American Psychological Association, has identified from research, they've identified 3 factors that work together to produce successful treatment. 1, the use of evidence-based treatments appropriate for one's particular issue. So it's like I was saying before, CBT is very effective for many things, but certain treatments are more appropriate for particular kinds of issues. So while CBT might be effective for phobias, but there may be another kind of therapy that is more effective than CBT for phobias, just for example. Number 2, the clinical skill of the therapist. And number 3, one's own characteristics, the patient's characteristics, their values, preferences, and culture. Second bullet, a large-scale study of CBT reported that it was equally or more effective than other therapies in treating PTSD, general anxiety disorder, depression, and social phobia. So these disorders are all quite different from each other, except maybe they all share anxiety in common. Because even depression is closely associated with anxiety. Anyway, so CBT is broadly effective, but no studies have found that one psychotherapeutic approach is more effective for all conditions than any other psychotherapy, nor have they shown any relationship between a client's treatment outcome and the level of the clinician's training or experience. The most critical factor that determines treatment success is the client's relationship with the therapist. That's interesting, right? So that was true back when I was in college 20 years ago. I remember learning this, that the most effective treatment, the most effective factor is the relationship between the client and the therapist. There are going to be some therapists who are more effective than other therapists. In general, they're just better therapists. And there's going to be some people who are simply better at healing from therapy than other people are. Therapy is not for everyone. Some people do better with it. It's more effective for them. It's due to their own factors, their own characteristics, values, preferences, and culture. And any combination of those things. So, it might be tempting to assume that someone with 20 years of therapy experience is better at therapy, a better therapist. But the data seem to indicate that it's not so much the experience or the training. It's not whether you went to a 2-year training program or a 6-year training program. What's more important than those things is the skill of the therapist and the relationship between therapist and client. And also important is the particular approach for the particular problem. Because as I said, the first bullet point, number 1, the use of evidence-based treatment appropriate for one's particular issue. So it's got to be appropriate. Any questions there? And the final slide of this lecture, conclusion to tie it all together. So we've covered learning, thinking, and therapy. Learning, we learn from our own and others' experiences. The lessons we learn from traumatic experiences can cause maladaptive behaviors and thinking. About thinking, we've got negative emotions and hurts and fears that create anxiety or depression or fear-based thinking, which create self-defeating attitudes and mindsets. And these mindsets are negatively reinforced through avoidance conditioning and thought patterns. And therapy, by replacing a maladaptive behavior with good behavior, or maladaptive thoughts with good thoughts, or more functional thoughts, emotions are restored and behavior is fixed. Correcting behaviors affects beliefs, and correcting beliefs affects behaviors. So thoughts and behaviors are intimately related to one another. CBT attempts to affect both thinking and behaviors, and to affect behaviors through cognitive means and to affect thoughts through cognitive and behavioral means as well. So if we think about problems as having their the locus of the problem as well as the solution in the thoughts and behaviors, then CBT seems an effective approach and strategy for correcting these. That is the end of this lecture. Any questions? All right, here is your podcast assignment. And as I mentioned in the, I think in line or email, you no longer need to take, yeah, by email. You don't have to take notes anymore on podcast assignments. So no more note taking. I want to ease your burden a bit. So to do that, so now instead of notes, you're just gonna have to still go on Blackboard and just tick a box. It's like a multiple choice item. Just choose, I did listen to the podcast, and then when you save your answer or submit it, you get credit for listening to the podcast. And there's a link to the podcast on the Blackboard assignment, so you have it right there. It's all together. Now, for today's lab activities, I will break you into the breakout rooms first to discuss the podcast of last week. I will ask you to discuss two things. First thing is name two things that you found interesting. And then second thing is two questions that you wish that the show had answered. So two more things that you wonder. What?
We have people here at Chamkao. Can we just do the discussion group like in the Chamkao group here?
I think you're saying that you have a group.
Yes, like currently, like right now here. Can we like discuss like in our own group like that is currently here with me like in this location?
Definitely. So I'm gonna divide you into groups of 5 or 6. And if you're meeting in person, I also want you to divide into groups of 5 or 6.
Sorry for the podcast that we're supposed to discuss for the activity. If it's the one we did last week, is it the SciShow Katie Morgan? Yeah.
Yes. The SciShow with Katie Morton.
Yeah, just say on the slide, discuss our Better Nature podcast.
Yeah, I
so
was
it's
confused.
confusing.
I thought I missed the assignment, but yeah.
You're right. I made a mistake here. I got confused by the assignment, which is something you do during this week. I should have corrected that. On this slide, it should read, breakout rooms discuss SciShow Katie Morton. Thank you. Sorry for the confusing mistake on this slide. And after you are finished discussing in breakout groups, then I want you to complete an individual assignment. Everyone should submit on Blackboard this worksheet. Actually, you're not going to submit the worksheet. You just complete the worksheet on your own. And then, just like the podcast, I want you to tick a box that says that you completed the worksheet. And then you'll get credit. So it's based on your honest response that for both of these things. For the podcast and for submitting your worksheet. You're just going to report that you did it.